All right. Welcome, folks. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Michael Fraud. I'm the Assistant Program Director at Drisha. Very excited to have everyone back here for the second session of What is Halakhah, the fascinating history of an essential term with Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Zuckier. Rabbi Zuckier is a member of the Drisha faculty as well as a postdoctoral fellow in Jewish studies at McGill University. He received his PhD in ancient Judaism from Yale University and was also a member of Yeshiva University's Kol Elyon. He is also an alumnus of Yeshiva University's rabbinic ordination program at REITs, of Yeshiva Har Etzion, the Wexner and Tikva fellowships. We last week started this class, which is aiming to study the different meanings of the term halakha as they develop over time, and to use that as a lens for considering what that can say about the practice of halakha overall. How do we translate it? How do we understand its function? And what significance might there be in shifts in that over time? So last time we started talking about some definitions, started talking about the different ways that the term is used in various places. And today we are going to be talking a bit more about the origins of the term itself. With that, Rabbi Zuckier, I think we can go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. And as you said, last time we spoke about the term halakha and especially how it's used in classical rabbinic literature. Mishnah, Midrashic Halakhah, the Talmud, and we sort of got a sense of what it means or the range of things it can mean. It can refer to the oral law overall. It can refer specifically to traditions. It can refer to the law as practiced, more so than in theory, although not fully. But we saw there was a really a wide range or a variety of uses, of specific uses, but within that same broader picture of practical oral Torah, which I think is more or less how the term is used today. But we got a sense of how it's used in Chazal. And yeah, I'll just mention everyone's invited to join on screen if they can. It makes the learning experience better and more interactive. So everyone's invited to do that. But of course, for those who can't, we understand. So last time we looked at the term in Chazal in its classical sense, which largely those meanings continue. But now we're going to take a step back. We're going to look at the emergence of the term. Where does the term halakha come from originally, number one, and then number two, as sort of a meta question, how those discussions and some of the ideas, some of the theories as to where the term halakha comes from actually tells us a lot about the people studying the term. So a little historiography we'll throw in and should give us an interesting picture of how these things, how halakha plays out both in ancient Judaism and in the contemporary scholarly world over the last few decades. With that said, let's jump out to this shared screen, and here we go. So, okay, so we'll start. If we're looking for the source of the term halakha, the term in its straightforward sense does not appear in Tanakh, in the Bible. If it did, this would be a very, very short class. We don't have the term itself, but we do have some things that are somewhat related, and that you might draw a connection between them. Let's take a look at a few examples, and I could have given a bunch more, but we'll look at a few. You should warn them or teach them about the laws and teachings. You teach them the path that they should go on, and the actions they should do. Right. This is talking about Moshe as being charged as the great educator and judge of the people, and then he's going to appoint. Then he's asked to appoint judges under him. But there's the idea of you should tell them about the way they should go, the path they should follow, the way of life. You could say, the halakhah, if you want to jump a little bit, the way they should practice their religious lives and their lives overall. So there's no early source. It's not like we see Chazal say, derech Yechuba, this is halakha. Actually, there's Chazal, the rabbis in a bunch of different places say this refers to a whole bunch of different things, specific mitzvah or chesed or whatnot. But we don't find the teaching that says, Yechuba, that's halakha. But we could draw that conclusion or that connection ourselves. Or another example, this jumping to Dvarim, Moshe himself is speaking. The whole path, the whole way that God commanded you, you should go on that way, go on that path. In order that you live long in the land that you'll inherit, land, presumably land of Israel. So this is, again, follow the path that God set out. So that's similar, but from someone else's mouth, but a similar idea. Alternatively, we might think of this path that we're going on, a different verse in Dvarim. Again, Moshe's speech. You should follow the commandments of God, to go in his ways, not in path that God sets out for you, but to follow in God's own ways, as this is generally understood. So the rabbis understand God is merciful, you should be merciful. God visits the sick. Avram, you should visit the sick, etc. So maybe the path that we're going on, if that's where Halakhah comes from, is not just the path that is laid out explicitly by God, but also just the path that God takes. We should follow God in that path as well. So from all these examples, you might say, it talks about following a path, whether it's God's path or the path that God provided, and maybe that's a source for Halakhah. Could be, but we don't really have the connective tissue. We don't really have sources that say, yes, this is talking about Halakhah. Yelchu b'Halakhah. We don't find those sources. So, there may be some relationship, but it's a bit of a jump. Actually, I took a look at the Encyclopedia Talmudit entry, the Talmudic Encyclopedia entry for Halakhah, and they threw in this pasuk. They said, Haderech Yelchuba, the path you go on, maybe that's where Halakhah comes from. Maybe, but there's not really an early source. They didn't have anything based on it. They're surmising that, and maybe they're right. But we don't have a clear basis. Let's look at another possible biblical term, also related to Halakhah in some way, or apparently related, that may be the source. And this sounds a little odd, but hopefully it'll make sense in a few minutes. So if we look in Ezra, and Ezra, of course, one of the late biblical books set in the early Second Temple period. So and under Persian rule, right? The Ezra and Nehemiah come back, and they talk to the governor, and the governor allows them to come back, and to resettle and rebuild the temple. So but it's not free, no free temples, as the expression goes. And it says, okay, the king should get the hain kiryata datit b'nei shuraya yishtachlulun, in light of the fact that the city will be rebuilt and the walls will be reinforced. This is Jerusalem. What will he get? He'll get minda v'lo b'halach. He'll get these three things. There are three different types of taxes. I saw one translation says the toll, the tribute, and the custom tax. But essentially, it's three different types of taxes. We'll see a couple different translations of what they are. So you have to, and if you don't give it, then I'll destroy your city, right? Or and then it says later on, a few verses later, he says that the midah v'lo v'halach miteheb loan. They were paying their three types of taxes. And then a few chapters later, again, announcing to the people that they go and pray in the temple, that the minda v'lo v'halach lo shel d'mirma alehom. Right? Then he sort of gave him a respite from the tax. The point is, the term halach means tax in this period. And again, the later you get in the biblical period, the closer you get to the rabbinic period. So some have raised the theory, and we'll spell it out a bit further in a couple minutes, that this halach tax somehow is the precursor to the term halakhah. Now, what do taxes have to do with law? Well, there's some connection, right? There's even a whole area of tax law. But we'll get to more specifics in a second. Let's first figure out what exactly this is. Rashi doesn't give us much detail. He says, Mine misimhem bekesef gugol. There are different taxes, head taxes. He doesn't give specifics, but even Ezra and the Metzudat Zion each give a different theory as to what this halach tax is. He says, the minda min harichush, this is your estate tax, or property tax maybe. Uvlo mas hamedino, this is a state, based on the state, on the location tax. Halach meches haholchim derech hamelech. It's called the halach tax, the going tax, because it's a toll. It's a road toll. If you use the King's Road, of course, is always the main road, but derech hamelech, right? That's the main road everyone would use, like the highway. Use the King's Road, you have to pay a tax. So the halach maybe is a highway tax, or the Mitzudatzion, it's a different theory. Halach hu tishura amevi'im lamelech be'et ya'avor alehem. No, it's not. You're not the one going. The king is going. Whenever the king would pass through, there would be some sort of levy that the king would place on the people. You'd have to give it to him. Whatever exactly the halach is, it's some sort of tax that either relates to you going places or the king going places on these theories. Whether these are the whichever etymology is right, these or others, it won't make a difference for our purposes. Just hold that thought, this idea of the halach possibly relating to halakha. Before we get to that, some have noted, actually we mentioned this name earlier, a commentary on the Aruch translation suggested that this uncle is maybe an early source. It says in the context of marital law, marrying a slave or whatnot, you can set aside a young slave to your son, and then you have to treat her like the usual rule of girls, meaning like a wife. And uncle says, if you set her aside for your son, or you establish her for your son, you should follow the laws of the daughters of Israel, like Kimishpat. The problem with this is Unkelus is pretty late. Unkelus is, even on the earliest dates for Unkelus, it's during the period of the Tanaim. So this wouldn't be an early source, but unless it points to something earlier. So maybe it's possible that Unkelus is pointing to something earlier, and the idea of Halakhah corresponding to Mishpat. But that doesn't seem, and most likely Unkelus is following what Chazal are doing. So let's keep thinking about our halach theory, and that's picked up by the great Talmud scholar Shaul Lieberman. It's a footnote. I think nowadays this would be at least an article. Who knows? Maybe a book. Back in the good old days, 70 years ago, this was a footnote. His etymology of the term halakha. So he's talking sort of in passing. He mentioned halakha as a footnote. He says the origin of this word is not definitively established. Right? It's not clear exactly what halakha means, but he tries to draw a parallel to the term canon in Roman law and in Latin, right? So canon is like the canon law, it was like the basic law that they had. But he points out that, he quotes Wenger, canon originally meant the rent paid by a tenant to the landowner. So canon, it came to mean law in Roman culture, but originally it meant taxes, land tax paid to the government. And he says, well, maybe, and then he says canon is like regula. Regula is also a rule. So, and there's something synonymous here. They both have stability, regularity, and fixedness, right? If you have a set tax every year, it's like the law, right? It's a set thing. It doesn't change. Whether the law changes or not, maybe that can be another discussion, or at least in theory, how law works and whether it's supposed to be fixed or not. But the canon is similar to taxes in the sense that, right, the canon as law and canon as tax would be consistent in that it's stable, regular, and fixed. Okay. And if you think about that in light of the term halakha, maybe we have a parallel here, right? In Ezra, the tax halach is mentioned, as we saw. It's been identified, and now we get the Akkadian, it's been identified with the Babylonian ilku tax, okay? All you need to know about ilku is that it's related to halakha, right? It's basically the same, you drop the hey, but you have the same vowel. The u is like the I at the end. It's pretty close. The term halakha, which is already extant in the laws of Hammurabi, right, centuries earlier than Ezra. And apparently in Aramaic, a bit later, the land tax is called the hilcha, which of course makes sense. It's the halach, just with the aleph at the end. But this is a step closer to getting us to halakha, or the regula, or the canon, or the fixed rule. So that's his suggestion, that just like in Akkadian, Aramaic, and Hebrew, we have this term ilku or halach or halakha, that is connected to the Hebrew halakha as law, just like the canon in Roman law, it can mean both, first means tax and then means law. It's a similar move to go from tax to law because it's something that's fixed. It's a pretty cool and interesting theory, although we'll see some dispute it. But he says in practice, halakha has the same meaning as horos, which is boundary, which means regula. It's a statement of law. It's something that's set in stone, right? A boundary, halakha. This is the law. It's like a line. You have the shurat hadin, the line of the law in rabbinic literature. And it talks about moving the boundary, and that's comparable to changing the law. So that's his suggestion, which would tie into the verses we saw in Ezra, this halach text in Ezra, and would tie into Akkadian the Akkadian term for tax as well, following that Roman law parallel, which is pretty cool. So that's one theory. I don't know if anyone has comments or questions on this, but we'll, if you do, speak up now. If not, we're going to look at an alternate theory that Tzvi Abush, more recently, only 3.5 decades ago, has a different Akkadian term that he wants to throw in, alaktu and halakhah. So as you can tell, the alaktu term is going to be his preferred term, where we're going to look at a few snippets from the article. But basically, alaktu has been translated way, path, course, behavior, and the like, which of course is very similar to how halakha is translated. And he ties it into this idea of how, right, he talks about the gods of the night sky. Alaktu is like the planetary motion. That's the origin of the term, right? The movement of the planets. And that then comes to mean like divine revelation, oracular decision, right? God's plan. So God has a plan for the stars. God also has a plan for the humans and how they should act. There's some connection there between the two, between the what's going on in the stars and what's going on Earth. Of course, that's how oracular decision making works, right? You can sort of look at the stars. That's how astrology works. You look at the stars, it tells you what's going on Earth, because both of them are part of God's plan in the ancient conception, or maybe even some not so ancient conceptions. So then he talks about this term that we find. Where is it? Right, this term lamad, which is very similar to the Hebrew lamad, and is found in connection with alaktu. And that's going to be interesting because, right, you're lomed halakhah in Hebrew, you study halakha, and there's also this idea of lamadu the alaktu. Fine. And now let's bring it back to the Hebrew side of things. So as he says, halakha, the term halakha is known first in the Mishnah. We'll see that's not everyone agrees about that, but that's his assumption. And he talks about the form of the term, right? Halakha is like drasha, is like ri'aya, where it's not the same as halikha, drisha, or ri'iyah, but it's an alternate form, and it's like a more abstract judicial term, right? So a drasha is an exegesis as opposed to a drisha, which is something that someone asks from someone. Similarly, a halikha is going, and halakha is the more abstract legal version of the going, or the law. Fine. And so within that frame, if you think about this term in Akkadian, or the alakta lamadu in light of lamad halakha, that's a pretty striking parallel. This idea of, right, alakta lamadu is to seek out God's answer on something. Lomed halakha, you're essentially doing the same thing. You're studying the law, but if halakha comes from alaktu, it's the same point. You're studying the path, the vision that God has to the world. For the world, you're trying to figure that out. So Abush, he says, it could be that halakha just comes from inner Hebrew development, right? It could just be that sometimes, and actually we know this generally. I didn't take this in, but there's an article by one of my professors, Stephen Fraud, who also incidentally is Michael's uncle. Sorry to out you, Michael, about how abstract terms emerge in the rabbinic period. So you'll find increasingly abstract terms, a root that exists biblically and in the Qumran, and then all of a sudden in Chazal will become an abstract term. So halakha is apparently one of them. So it could just be an internal development that the term halakha came out of the verb halak. That could be, but as you can guess, he prefers to see it as stemming in some way from the Akkadian, either directly from the Akkadian or through the Aramaic. This idea that you sort of move from this idea of the divine plan, the way the stars move, that going, and then apply that to the vision for the world, the plan for the world, and then the practice that one should follow. He does note Shaul Lieberman's approach, that halakha comes from ilku. He says it's interesting, but he doesn't agree because ilku is masculine, halakha is feminine, so it shouldn't have derived from it. We're not going to go into all the grammatical niceties of it, but he disagrees. He thinks it comes not from the term for tax, but for the term for like a vision or like the plan for the stars that then is correlated with the plan on Earth. Yeah, fine. So those are two different theories as to prior Akkadian roots for the term halakha. I don't think either of these suggestions are overwhelming proof. It could be. They're very, very interesting and suggestive parallels in each case in different ways. But it could also be that the term just emerged, as I said, sort of naturally. As your language comes up with more abstract terms, so you're going to come up for a term with halacha. It's not at all obvious that it had to come from Akkadian, but it could be. It's possible. So we have some options there. We're going to turn now to focus on, or after I'll take some questions, we'll turn now to focus on the Dead Sea Scrolls and the term halakha. I don't know if there's any deeper, historiographical conclusions we can draw from this first piece. I think it's more just, Akkadian scholars are doing their thing and having some debates on the technicalities of it. So I don't know if there's anything deeper on that part. Maybe there is, and I'm just not thinking of it. But we'll see the Dead Sea Scrolls, things get a lot more personal in various ways. But before that, any questions or thoughts, feel free to put them in the chat or say, oh, I see. Okay, there's a question about halakha as a concept and how it relates to different practice in different areas of law, in this case, gender and homosexuality and those issues. So as I said last time, I should have repeated this time, we're not talking about the concept of halakha because there's a lot to say there. That's just a different topic. We're talking about the term halakha. So as far as I know, there's, the term halakha doesn't play into those issues more than any other issue. So that could be a different series. We can discuss that. But any other questions any other questions on the term halakha and what we've seen, different possible etymologies are very much welcome. Or maybe someone has a different Akkadian term that they think fits better. I don't know. Never know. Okay, so then we will keep going, or I guess as they say in Akkadian, alaktu or something like that. So let's talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so as we saw in the Abish article, he says, the term only appears in the Mishnah, first appears in the Mishnah. And we're going to see there's a bit of a debate about this. Number one, does the term actually appear in Hebrew literature prior to the Mishnah? Number one. And number two, maybe it doesn't appear, but maybe it's sort of, everyone knows it and it's sort of it stands behind some of the texts. So we're going to have to examine that ourselves with some of these examples. So let's jump back in to the shared screen. And there's an article by John Meyer, who's a Bible scholar at Notre Dame, and I believe a Catholic priest. So here's his analysis, right? This is almost 18 years ago now. Is there halakha, the noun, at Qumran, right? Qumran being the site where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And he says, very parallel to what we just said just a minute ago, he says this essay is not about the phenomenon that we now call halakha. It's pretty clear. You look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, various texts, the rule of the community, which, as you would guess, has a lot of rules that pertain to the community, or the halachic letter. We'll talk about that name in a bit. MMT, Miktsat Ma'aseh HaTorah, some of the actions or laws of the Torah. There's a whole letter about different things that people should and shouldn't do and what people get wrong about Jewish law. So it's clear from those texts, there's a lot of legal issues that are discussed. And even in Philo and Josephus, other first century texts that are not from Qumran, that are in Greek, there's clearly a lot of legal discussions in those things, and we can call that halakha. We'll talk more about that in a bit. But his paper is specifically about the question of the term halakha. Number one, was the Hebrew noun halakha in current use in the first century BCE and CE, around when the Dead Sea Scrolls are from? And if so, did it carry the sense clear from the Mishnah that it means a legal opinion or ruling about proper Jewish conduct, right? So number one, does the term appear at all? And number two, if it appears, what does it mean? Does it mean halakha as we understand it from rabbinic literature, or does it mean something else maybe? So we're going to look at some of these texts ourselves, some of these texts from Qumran, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I use the text provided in the study edition. So here's a text, Rule of the Community, right, as was just mentioned, which talks about various rules, but it also has some exhortations of the people, and it has this ceremony that they would have with priests. Right, the priest would say the greatness of God, and they would say all sorts of things to the Israelites who were there, and the priest and the Levites would speak and about the sins of the Israelites. We're not going to go into detail about this, but then what they would say Bikola Ovrim Bivrit, all these people who are passing through this covenant, all the people who were at this ceremony, right? And it seems to have happened on Shavuos. So if you're ever wondering why there are no rituals on Shavuos, you can always wonder a bit more about what they did at Qumran. Apparently, they have this ritual every year. Everyone would pass through the treaty. Modim achreihem lemor. They would say as follows: Na'avinu pashanu chatanu hirshanu anu vavotenu milafanenu. We sinned and we did wrong and we were evil, us and our forefathers, milafanenu, before us. Halakhatenu. And then there's some words missing, and then emet b'tzadik. But one way of reading this is we sinned halakhatenu, with our halakha in regard to Jewish law. We sinned. That is one possible reading of this text. Meyer discusses this, how right, halichatenu or halakhatenu, and he says that there's a bit of a debate. Some texts, some dictionaries and whatnot say that it's talking about halakha. Some say the word hey, the letter hey shouldn't really belong there, and it really should be bilechtenu, in our going, right? So we sinned bilechtenu, presumably bishvirut libein or something like that. We followed the stubbornness of our heart and we sinned. And we're not going to go through all the arguments. His suggestion, which sounds very much reasonable, is that most likely this is bilechtenu, not bihalachatenu, that we sinned in our halakha. I think that idiom would be unusual anyway. We don't find that certainly in later literature. But bilechtenu, in our going, in our path, generally, not in our halakha path, but lechtenu, our walking, our going, in general, we sin. And that seems to be the more likely reading. There's another passage, though, that maybe is a bit more convincing. So let's take a look at this. Here, again, it's part of this exhortation, but it's sort of like the narrator is giving this speech. With the spirit of the wisdom of truth of God, of a person's ways, are atoned all of his sins. A lot of flowery language about atonement through repentance and understanding and whatnot. A lot more to say about that in a different context, in the context of atonement, but not for today. And uvanot nafsho, if you pain your soul or lower yourself, the kol chukeil, for all of God's laws, yitar bisaro, your flesh becomes pure. The can then be purified, or it's the equivalent of being purified with waters of purification, and to be sanctified with waters of purification. And you should prepare his feet for halakhat tamim, for the pure halakha, arguably, in all the ways of God. As God commanded in terms of the holidays, and not to go right or left, and not to go after, not to veer away from any of his teachings. Instead, you should do the halakhat tamim, right? So it's halakha, right? Halakhat tamim, a halakha of pureness, a pure halakha. Everyone should prepare for pure halakha. So isn't this an occasion where the term halakha appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls? And Meyer discusses this as well. He says, at first glance, it appears to provide a solid attestation, halakhat tamim, walking or conduct or behavior in perfectly. But the problem is, and this, the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a handful of texts that are found, and a lot of the texts have multiple scrolls, meaning this rule of the community, it wasn't just one scroll with that text in it. There were multiple scrolls found in multiple caves that talk about different issues, relate different parts of this text, and they're all fragmentary. But if you compare rule of the community, that one of the ones that were found at the first Qumran cave with a different, that's one QS, with a different rule of community text found at the fourth Qumran cave. It's a very similar text overall, but very significantly for our purposes, instead, you have, instead of lehalachat tamim, you have lehalech tamim, to go purely, which is a common term we find throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls. And most likely this is the original term. Meyer argues for this as well, and it seems to be accepted. This is the standard view, that the term lehalachat tamim is, it's a variant, but it's not the real term. It's presumably the really should be lehalech tamim, and lehalachat tamim wouldn't be like the term halakha. It would be some a variant spelling, or like the feminine form of the infinitive, going purely in the same way, but not the term halakha. So that's Meyer's conclusion. And that's why he says, we have no textual evidence to the existence of the rabbinic sense of halakha in the 1st century BCE or CE. And even the manuscript evidence is at best debatable, at worst non-existent. Infinitives don't usually have feminine forms, but this would be some variant form, right? So it would be a bit unusual, or it could just be a copyist's error. So that's his conclusion. And again, some people still dispute this, but it seems to be the standard view is that the term halakha does not appear in any of these texts. It means to go in general, like to go, but there's no sense of halakha there. That being said, there's a different angle through which some scholars have argued that halakha is not in the text of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but somehow stands behind the text. And we're going to get into that in a second. But first, if there's any other questions, happy to take those. And if not, we'll jump into some other Qumran materials. I mean, like, there's so much to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I feel like I could give like a 10-minute survey, but then we wouldn't be able to do the other stuff. But if you have any questions about the Dead Sea Scrolls in general, feel free to stick around after and ask, and we can have a discussion after the basic class is over. Yeah, fine. So if there's no questions, then let's go forward and talk about Dorshei HaChalakot, and try to listen to that term, see if there's some resonances or not. But this is going to be from a Pesher Isaiah text. Pesher is a very interesting genre of text. We only have it at Qumran. Pesher means interpretation, like in Aramaic in the Bible, we have that term in Daniel, or pitaron, is the same word in Hebrew, with tough shins switching. Anyway, so Pesher means interpretation, and it's a genre where you take prophetic texts. We'll see Nahum, we'll see Yeshayahu here. You take a prophetic text and you go line by line through the text. You quote a verse or a few verses and you explicate it, but specifically with an eye to what's happening now. So if there's some discussion of a war between people that's prophesied in the Bible, in the prophet, you say, okay, here's what it's talking about. There's this war between the Greeks and the Jews in 160 BCE. That's what that prophet was talking about hundreds of years prior. So it's an interpretation that tries to flesh out what the prophecies are about. And it appears there's many different Pesher texts that are found from Qumran, and we don't have them from elsewhere. It's really a genre we only have from Qumran. It's a very interesting one. So let's take a look at there's maybe a couple of Pesher texts and maybe one other text that uses this phrase there's maybe a dozen times that this term Dorshei Halakot comes up. We're going to look at 3 of them. Fine. So first, there's this long citation which we're going to skip, but this is a citation in the English. They tell you where the citation is from. They cheat. So it's from Isaiah 30, 15 to 18. So this citation from the prophet Isaiah, that in chapter 30, and we're not going to read it because for our purposes it's less significant. It says Pesher Hadavar, the interpretation of the matter, which is always how it starts its interpretation. Le'acharit hayamim, talking about the end of days, or maybe later on in days. Al Dorshei Halakot. It's talking about Dorshei Halakot. Literally means doresh is to seek. Halakot is smooth things. It's about the seekers of smooth things. Asher Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem. And here the text is a little cut off, but Torah below something. Lev Kila Dush. So we don't really get from this text what they do. We'll see more elsewhere. But it's a group that's in Jerusalem. Now, I don't know if someone who knows a little bit about the history of Qumran, if you're in a cave in Qumran and you're saying you're throwing shade at the people, the other group in Jerusalem, who are you probably attacking? Any suggestions? So, all right, if no one's jumping in. Right, so generally people see Qumran, the Qumran group, the Dead Sea group, as either the Essenes or maybe the Sadducees, but they're definitely understood generally as a sectarian group in very broad strokes. And the sectarian groups are generally seen as opposed to the Pharisee groups, the Prushim, who are seen as the forerunners of the rabbis. Every single word I said is disputed and overly simplistic, but that we could be a whole other class on that. This sort of big picture theory people have is Qumran are sectarians. They're opposed to the Pharisees. Pharisees are in the cities in Jerusalem. They can, at least at some point, they controlled things. And this is this breakaway group, right? It's like the breakaway shul, right? They're out. They broke away. They don't have the real estate. They went off into some cave somewhere. But they have a good kiddush. But and they're right. They're not happy about what's going on in Jerusalem. So maybe this is attacking the Pharisees. Okay, so I'll hold that thought. The Pharisees in Jerusalem. Maybe that's who the Darshei Halakot, the seekers of smooth things, are. And just about that term a bit more, it appears in the Bible in a few places. Lidrosh Halakot. Halakha is something smooth, something easy, right? So that we find the phrase used like, don't be honest with me. Don't tell me the hard truth. Tell me the halakot. Give me the easy stuff, right? So if you're doresh halakot, you're seeking easy things. You're seeking leniencies. You want to have an easy life instead of living out in the desert with all these extreme purification rules, and you can't come into contact with people and all these limitations. You want to be able to live in the city and not have limitations, and be able to interact with whoever you want and not worry about becoming impure. Those are people, they're seeking smooth things. Those are the Pharisees. They're trying to be lenient. Let's look at a couple of other appearances of this term here. Pesher Nachum. This will be quoted from the verse quoting from Nachum 2:12, right? So the verse is Asher halach ari lavosham gur ari ve'en macharid. That's the verse. Pishro, the meaning is al Demetrius Melech Yavan, right? So obviously you can tell Demetrius Melech Yavan. That's not biblical Hebrew, right? It's clearly talking about a historical figure, right? Yavan being Greece. Demetrius is the Greek king. Asher bikesh lavo Yerushalayim. He sought to enter Jerusalem. Ba'atzat Darshei Halakot, with the advice of what they call those looking for easy interpretations, the seekers of smooth things. He didn't come. Kilo Natan el Yerushalayim b'yad Malchei Yavan me'Antiochus adamod moshlei kitiyim ve'achar terames. God didn't let him in. God didn't want Demetrius coming in, because from the time of Antiochus in the 160s until later, until the Kitiyim, the Romans came, no one would come to Jerusalem, so he didn't let him in. But what was going on? Jerusalem, he was asked to go to Jerusalem by these Darshei Halakot. So it sounds like there's also some political tension between the Qumran group and the Darshei Halakot, because they're inviting, they want this outside group to take over, and right, they want this general or king from Greece to come and take over, and Qumran is not happy about that, and God's on their side. God didn't let him come in. Okay, that's another thing about Darshei Halakot. And now, looking at the Damascus document, which it's not quite a pesher, but it does share a lot with the Pesharim. It does use the term pishro in a couple of places as well. So this also is going to be biblical interpretations, as you see in the English. There's a couple of cited texts, Hosea 4:16. So let's look at this. The verse says, Kifara sorera kain sarar Yisrael. Actually, the biblical text doesn't have the kain, but like a wayward cow, Israel has gone astray. What's that talking about? It interprets it, Ba'amod ish halatzon, the man of ridicule stood up, Asher hitifli Israel, he dripped for Israel, meimei chazav, deceitful waters, vayatem betohu lo derech, and he misled them on darkness, not a path, la'ashach givhot olam, to undermine the high things of the world, v'lasur mitzvot tzedek, to diverge from the true path, la'asiyah gvul, to move the boundary, asher gavlu rishonim benachlatam, that the early ones set in their land. So remember what we saw in Lieberman, right? Moving the boundary often is talking about changing the law. L'ma'an hidavek b'hem et alot habrit. That's an invocation of the curses at the end of Deuteronomy, right? They're trying to have the curses stick to them. L'haskiram lacherev nikmat nikam brit, in order to have them be handed over to the sword, seeking vengeance of the covenant. Ba'avur, so what did they did all these things wrong, and what caused it? Ba'avur asher darshu b'chalakot. It's because they sought the smooth things. They were looking for leniencies. They were looking for gaps in the law. They were looking for leniencies. They were looking for the nice of neck, right? The animal that has a nice smooth neck, it's not carrying too many burdens, right? It has it easy. That's what they were, right? Because remember, the verse is talking about cows, right? So a cow with a smooth neck is one that's not working hard. It's seeking smooth things, like a smooth neck, I guess. So right? So that's, or I guess the English here, they have handsome neck. Same idea, right? They're not working hard. They're taking the easy path. So throughout these passages, we see there's both political tension and religious tension between the Qumran group and this other group that they call the Darshei Halakot, who are in Jerusalem. A lot of scholars have argued that this is talking about none other than the Pharisees, as we mentioned, the forerunners of the rabbis. Now, what's interesting is, and this would tie in to the idea that Qumran, there are all these stringencies in terms of ritual, different ritual purity and the like. And arguably, they're saying we have all these stringencies, these people have all these leniencies, and God hates them, and that's why all these prophets, the true interpretation of all these prophecies, are against what those Pharisees are doing in Jerusalem with their leniencies and whatnot. So what does this all have to do with anything? What does that have to do with halakha? So the argument has been made by multiple people, but well put in this paragraph by Professor Lawrence Schiffman of NYU, and we'll just read it. This article is called New Light on the Pharisees, Insight from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he says, because the Qumran sectarians objected to Pharisaic halakha, not based directly on scripture, the Pharisees are referred to in the scrolls as dorshei halakot, literally seekers after smooth things. The phrase draws on the biblical usage of halakot as lies or falsehoods, but halakot is also a pun on halachot, the plural of halakha, and the term for religious laws known to us from later rabbinic usage. So this is the basic argument that Schiffman and others make, that if you're talking about dorshei halakot, seeking after smooth things, you're not just citing that biblical turn of phrase, but you're also probably implying something about dorshei halachot. And as we know, to be doresh halakha is, that's what you do, right? You study, you interpret halakha, you're doresh halakha. So that the phrase together, I think, is partially what gave rise to this. We'll keep going. This pun indicates that halakha is a term for religious law. It was already common Pharisaic usage as early as the Hasmonean period. Now, conveniently, we don't have any Pharisaic texts in the original, right? We only have, Chazal, the rabbis quote some things from the Prushim, if they even are the Pharisees, but you can't say, well, I looked at all the Pharisaic material and it's not there, because we don't have any Pharisaic material. So he's saying probably, if there was Pharisaic material, it would have said halachot. And this is a pun and a polemic against that. And he says also the term halakha means tradition, as we saw this last week, tradition of the fathers, of the elders, right? Halakha can mean, but it can also mean a specific tradition that was passed down. So the dorshei halakot, they're interpreting their traditions, but they're interpreting it falsely. They're choosing falsehoods. They're seeking opportunities to violate the law. They're choosing luxury. Fine. And they violate the covenant. This is the passage we saw. Violate the covenant, annul the law, band together to do away with the righteous. And that's why the Pharisees have it all wrong and only Qumran has it right. So this is the theory that some have raised, that dorshei halakot is a pun on dorshei halachot. Needless to say, this is a little controversial for a few reasons. Number one, if your best evidence for a term's existence is a pun playing on that term, that's a little bit of a weak basis, right? Because, I don't know, maybe there's some other term that they were using that it's a pun for. Maybe it's halashot. I don't know. You can make up anything, right? But it's sort of circular reasoning, right? How do we know they were using the term halachot? Because it says halakot, and obviously that's a pun on halachot. Well, you're presuming your conclusion. That's one weakness. And another weakness is it could be that halakot and halachot sounds more similar to the modern Western ear and the modern Western pronunciation of Hebrew than the ancient, right? Because a kuf doesn't quite sound like a chaf, and the chet doesn't quite sound like a hey. But if you look at the spelling here, the transliteration here it's extremely similar, right? But in any event, there's some weaknesses with this idea. I think it's sort of an open question. I think some scholars will tell you that it is a pun on halachot. Some will tell you it's not. But in any event, this is an argument not that the term halakha appears at Qumran, but that it was known, it was common knowledge, and obviously these terms are a pun and a play on that word, right? And as I said, it appears multiple times, like about a dozen times in our Qumran corpus. So, that the thought would be if the term halakha existed, it was obviously well known, to the point where they would make the same pun multiple times and it became really a catchphrase. Alternatively, this has nothing to do with halakha at all, and dorshei halakot is drawing from the biblical text. And so either no one knew what halakha meant, it wasn't a word, or it stands behind multiple passages in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's an interesting debate. We'll talk about that a bit more in a bit. Names of scrolls. Another way, and now we're going to move more into the modern period. When 20th century scholars named Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in the 40s, and then somehow it took them about 45 years to get through all of them, long story, but they named them, some of them gave them names like Halachic letter. This is Miktzat Maseh Torah, right? So MMT, which I think it's more frequently called now, actually follows the name, the text itself. The text starts off by saying these are some of the teachings of the Torah, Miktzat Maseh Torah. That would be the name it gives itself. Modern scholars called it the Halachic letter, or a different text, 4Q, that means it's found in the fourth cave at Qumran, 4Q Halakhah A, right? It's just called the Halachic text. What's in the text? Or 4Q Halakhah B. What's in 4Q Halakhah B? I don't know, it talks about 1,000 cubits and priests and different sacrifices and what to do on the Sabbath. So it doesn't say the word halakha, of course, but they say, oh, it sounds like it's talking about law. Or 4Q Halakha C. This has only about 10 words in it. Miyom, Lishenim, Dachi, Liached, Nazid, Nadivemo. This is all that's there. This is all the words they could reconstruct. Or look at the English. There's not much here, but they decided enough here. The word pure appears. Maybe that's what it was. This must be a halachic text. So they called it 4Q Halakha C. So there's something unusual, and as is noted, article about names assigned to scrolls. So right, it mentions that sometime some of the early scholars of the Dead Sea Scrolls who gave these names. One of the examples is the term halakha on the text we just saw. Content designation based on the later rabbinic use of the term, even though the word does not appear at all in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they mention that if you look in these namings, right, which appeared back in the day, it says, right, in 1957 and 62, it says that none of the editors elaborate on the name assigned to the manuscripts. They just gave it that name. Yeah, this is halakha, fine. They weren't too self-critical or self-reflective about that. They sort of just gave it this name, halakha. And beyond that, beyond the naming of the scrolls, in a variety of works about Qumran and about other ancient Jewish or pre-Christian or Christian texts, we also find this term a lot, right? Lawrence Schiffman's first book is The Halakhah at Qumran, or Philip Siegel, The Halakhah of Jesus of Nazareth, according to the Gospel of Matthew, right? That's not, I don't know, you translate that into Hebrew, you could like publish a sefer and try selling it in Mea Shearim or something, but that wouldn't go over so well, right? It's a little jarring, the association here, or this a little bit less extreme, Aron Shemesh, Halakhah in the Making, which is about the relationship between Qumran law and rabbinic law and trying to draw connections between them. Or this article, Samaritan Halakhah, right? The Samaritans have their own version of the Bible, of the Pentateuch at least, and their own traditions, their own interpretations of it. They wouldn't use the term halakha themselves, but this is a projection of the term halakha. So across the board, and there's many more, ancient Judaism, ancient Jewish texts that were written before the term halakha ever existed are now referred to by contemporary scholars as halakha. Halakha of Qumran, halakha of Jesus, and there's multiple works that talk about the halakha of Jesus, or Samaritan halakha, etc. So what exactly is going on here? Because right as we're finding again and again, the actual textual evidence in historical context for the term halakha is pretty weak. The term itself doesn't seem to appear at all until rabbinic literature. And yet people see puns on the term that doesn't appear. People name texts using the word halakha, and then they refer to the whole corpus as halakha, which is apparently anachronistic. The term didn't exist back then. People don't call biblical law halakha generally, right? You wouldn't say, let's say, I don't know, the laws of shomrim, of baileys, of people watching other people's things in Sefer Shlomo. You wouldn't say, yes, that's the halakha of Exodus. That's not generally how it's referred to. Halakha is usually focused on Chazal. So what's behind this focus and the prevalence of using this term halakha about ancient Judaism, even pre-Chazal, even before the term apparently exists? So I think at least a little bit of it is about a struggle for, how to understand both the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves and really how to understand the whole field of ancient Judaism, or what's sometimes called ancient Judaism. So first we'll talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then we'll broaden it a little bit So Lawrence Schiffman, this is an article he wrote, and then he basically wrote a book expanding on this idea. The argument is that, of course, all scholars have particular biases, right? And historiographers try to figure out what those biases are and how they play themselves out in the scholarship. And Judaic studies has its fair share of that. And the history of research on the Dead Sea Scrolls is an excellent example of people playing out their biases. So first of all, he notes for many years, it was basically all Christians working on the scrolls, and that was by design. The people who were given control of it were Christian, and they didn't let Israelis, they said, for West Bank, which was under the control of Jordan, you couldn't have Israelis, but they didn't want to have non-Israeli Jews either, which probably has less to do with geopolitics and more with religion. And I think Schiffman even uses the word Judenrein, which a little bit of a trigger word for some in this article. But he says, what has been the effect of this confessional limitation? Or what's the impact of keeping Jews out of the scholarship for decades as being the people who worked on the texts? So first he says it's allowed the rise of an entire genre of Christian scroll research. And basically his theory is, and this checks out, conservative Christians want to accent the uniqueness of Jesus. So they say Qumran is very Jewish and very halachic. The more halachic Qumran is, the more distinct and new Jesus is. And that's the conservative idea that they're less universalistic, they're more particularistic. Jesus had this special revelation, this special unique status that diverges completely from what came before. Right? It was a full revelation. And then more liberal Christians see Christianity as closer in origins to Judaism. No, it didn't come out of nowhere. It developed out of ancient Judaism. And then they want to play down and minimize the halachic nature of Qumran. Right? To these scholars, Qumran is seen as closer in spirit and practice to Christianity. In his book, Reclaiming the Dead Sea Scrolls, Schiffman goes through some passages of Christian scholarship and says, that they sort of look at the archaeology of Qumran and they say, this is the scriptorum, and this is where they would say grace after meals, and they're projecting their, sort of their Christian categories onto the text, which obviously was onto both the archaeology of the site of Qumran and onto all the texts that are relevant, and of course Qumran, the community there existed before, well before Jesus was born. And he contrasts that with, you could just sort of change the terms. Instead of saying scriptorum, you can say Beit Midrash, and all of a sudden it feels a lot more Jewish, right? So partially what's going on here, and that's the claim of his book, Reclaiming the Dead Sea Scrolls, is the Dead Sea Scroll scholarship was basically a place where Christian theology was playing itself out. And Qumran was seen as pre-Christian in one way or another, either pre-Christian and therefore similar to Christianity, or pre-Christian and therefore different from Christianity, but through that lens. And the reclaiming of Dead Sea Scrolls with the early Jewish Dead Sea Scroll scholars, Larry Schiffman, Joseph Baumgarten, and others, was to say, wait a second, we need to think about this. We need to think about Qumran not as pre-Christian, but as pre-rabbinic. And I think a lot of what's going on with the use of Halakhah by Schiffman himself in his book, the Halakhah Qumran, is an attempt to say, wait a second, we need to reset our assumptions. Instead of thinking about Qumran as pre-Christian, we should think about it as pre-rabbinic. And what's the most clear marker of rabbinic Judaism? Of course, it's Halakhah, certainly in contrast to Christianity, right? That's a point of polemic. Does the law provide life or death? I think the New Testament has something to say on the matter. So I think to the extent that you see the prevalence of Halakhah, both the term Halakhah referring to some of these things, so some of them may play into early internal Christian thoughts, but certainly people like Schiffman talking about the Halakhah Qumran, it's an attempt to reclaim the Dead Sea Scrolls. And you might make the argument, and I think if I didn't do a full survey, but a lot of the Halakhah of Jesus and the like really started coming about in the 80s and 90s, when Christian scholars also sort of came around to the idea that you have to look at rabbinic literature to get as well to get part of the picture, right? To understand Qumran, you have to look at what came before, you have to look at what came after in different versions and see where things tie in. So it's almost like the prevalence of Halakhah is a corrective of sorts, and maybe an overcorrective. Maybe they overcompensated to clarify and emphasize and maybe overemphasize some of the pre-rabbinic aspects of Qumran. Because as we said before, you don't usually refer to biblical law as Halakhah, but all of a sudden people are referring to this ancient, this post-biblical, rabbinic material or pre-Christian material, depending how you look at it, they're all of a sudden calling that halakha. So I think a lot of this is a struggle over how to interpret Qumran. Should you interpret Qumran in light of the Christianity that followed, or in light of the rabbinic Judaism that followed? And really, this is a broader point, as we see from these examples from Samaritan Halakhah and Halakhah Jesus. Part of this is also a question of ancient Judaism as a field as a whole. I use the term ancient Judaism. Some people don't like the term. The original term that people used to use was Spät Judaismus, right? Late Judaism from German. So what does that mean, late Judaism? That was a term, if you're a Christian, and particularly of the supersessionist type, that, Judaism is here and Christianity is here, improvement. So late Judaism is, actually there are different Christian theories, but either late Judaism is where Judaism went off the rails and Christianity picked up where it needed to go, or maybe Judaism was slowly improving to the point where it became Christianity. Different theories, as Schiffman alluded to, but the idea of late Judaism implying it's somehow defective and was sort of waiting for Christianity to come and fix things or improve things, that was sort of baked into the scholarship. So the ancient Judaism is an attempt to avoid that, although it may not succeed perfectly. But really, this question of what is the period of ancient Judaism? What is the period of Qumran? Who defines that? Is it defined by Christian scholars who talk about it as pre-Christian, or is it defined by Jewish scholars who talk about it as pre-Jewish, and also some Christian scholars who now talk about halakha as well? I think that's really what's at stake here, right? So when we talk about when does the term halakha emerge, we're talking about the emergence of a term. That's definitely true, and you can do all the studies of Akkadian that you want and all the text studies in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that's one part of it. But I think another piece of this very interesting history, and I think really what you find the projection of the term halakha onto Qumran, when it's not obviously there, is this very fraught issue of, does the field of ancient Judaism, does it belong to the Jews? Does it belong to the Christians? Who controls it? And of course, in theory, no one controls it. It's a scholarly field that should be open. But as we know, people have their own tendencies, their own biases, and it's played itself out in that vein. So I think that's the end of my spiel. Very happy to take questions, comments, or thoughts. But I think hopefully we've gained a little bit of a window both into the emergence of the term halakha, whether it's just from going in general and internal development, haderach yelchuba, and then you make that a bit abstract in rabbinic literature, whether it ties into some Akkadian term, which may appear in the term for tax that appears in Ezra, or the term for the moving of the constellations that refers to God's intent, God's plan, God's will. And then the question of whether the term appears in Qumran, either the term halakha itself or a pun on halakha, or the projection of halakha onto this literature as part of the struggle over the identity of ancient Judaism. So in any event, questions, the floor is open for questions or general discussion. I see someone's, yeah, go for it, Miriam.
Okay, sorry, I just wanted to see if I understood you correctly about why the Christians who were first to get their hands on the Dead Sea Scrolls were talking about halakha. Were you saying that by saying this was Jesus's halakha, that they were giving Christianity the legitimacy that they were looking for?
I don't know if I'd quite say that. So I think there's probably more than one reason. So I think in some of the earlier years, they might have said, this is halakha, meaning this is clearly different than what Christianity is doing. So we'll mark it as Jewish and different and halakha. And then Jesus's new path doesn't need halakha and whatever. That's one reason why you might do that, especially in the early years. I think in the later years, once there was this influence of Schiffman and Baumgarten and others who said, wait a second, we're forgetting about the connection between ancient Judaism and the relationship between Qumran and rabbinic literature. So then a lot of scholars, Christian as well, talked about this thing called common Judaism, which is during the Second Temple period. It's not like there were pre-Jews and pre-Christians. There was, to a large degree, everyone just agreed. There was just this thing called Judaism that basically everyone practiced, that was taken for granted, with some variations on top of that. So, that literature talked a lot about halakha. And I think some of the things we saw, Samaritan halakha or the halakha of Jesus, is within that frame, realizing that Jesus living in the first century was building on, or was living within a world that had this common Judaism that involved halakha. And so I don't think that they were legitimating it per se, as much as getting on board with the idea that you have to read early Christianity in light of early Judaism as well.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Sure. I see a couple questions in the chat. One, someone noted it fascinating that the Shulchan Aruch is written much later. That's definitely true. And right, as you say the word halakha, some people immediately jump and say, oh, halakha, the Shulchan Aruch is the halacha, right? The 16th century code of Jewish law, that is Jewish law. But I think as we saw last week, the term halakha goes back, it's very, very prevalent within rabbinic literature. It appears all over the place. And as we saw today, some argue it appears earlier, it has earlier sources. So that is definitely, yeah. So, I think the people who hyper associate halakha with the Shulchan Aruch, that's presumably because the Shulchan Aruch was very authoritative in terms of determining the law. But certainly the term has a very extensive prehistory prior to that. Yeah, Jason.
The people who were Dorshei Halachot, right? Like, what were their main objections to the Perushim with the Pharisees? Like, why were they saying they were being too lenient, or that they were seeking an easy path?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, we don't know for sure, but our best guess probably would be to look at the text Miktzat Maaseh HaTorah, or the so-called Halachic letter we talked about. Take a look over there. It talks mostly about ritual purity laws and how you conduct the temple, and all sorts of details in terms of that. Like if you, what Chazal call nitzok, if you pour a liquid, a stream from one place into another, if there's impurity below, does it defile the item above or not? A very technical issue of purity. And they said, you guys, in Jerusalem or whatnot, are lenient about this, but really this should be impure. And there's about a dozen or so examples of where they say you're being lenient and you should be more strict. So there were very specific things. So they have all sorts of laws. You look in Serach HaYachad, another text, as the rule of the community that we mentioned. It has all these rules of, if you speak ill of your fellow, you get punished, you get exiled from the camp. And there's a whole. I mean, if you want, email me. I can send you a handful of articles that talk about this. But probably the place to start is just to look at Miktzat Maaseh HaTorah, look at Serach HaYachad, and consider that in light of the Bible and in light of rabbinic literature, in light of whatever other texts we have, it seems like there's a lot of laws there that are much more stringent. And presumably they looked around, they said, wait, we're keeping these stringencies, other people aren't. Well, that's obviously because they don't have the proper teachings and they're being overly lenient. They're seeking leniencies, which is why they don't have our stringencies. So I think it was largely that those specific legal issues or ritual issues. Although it also, as we saw, there also are some like geopolitical things. Why'd you bring the Greeks to come march through Jerusalem? So it's obviously more than just the ritual issues, but that seems to be the central issue there. I got a question in the chat, a direct message. What's the difference between din and halakha in the Mishnah? So this, I guess, goes back to last week. I'll just mention din seems to be the theoretical law. Halakha seems to be the practical law. That appears more in the Midrash halakha, in the Midrashic text than in the Mishnah, but I think it would work the same in either case. Any other questions or comments? Okay, and I'll reiterate, as I said last week, everyone should always feel free to get in touch with me, Shlomo Zuckier @gmail.com, and to discuss these issues or anything else. A lot of interesting stuff. And just a heads up for next week is that this week we sort of bridged the earliest sources on halakha with contemporary scholarship and how it uses the term. Next time we'll remain in the modern period and look at some other contemporary issues, although we'll draw on some earlier things too, but we'll talk about some contemporary debates about how to apply the term. Michael, you wanna?
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Rabbi Zuckier, and thank you to everyone for being here. I just wanted to say a quick word about some of our upcoming opportunities for learning. In addition to our last class for this series next week, we are really about to head into our pre-Pesach learning with a number of special events coming up related to that. You can check out information about all of those at drisha.org/classes, but I wanted to highlight a few different things. This coming Sunday, the 14th at noon, we have our annual Rappaport Memorial Lecture with Rabbi Alex Israel on the topic of From the Sea to Sinai, Tests of the Wilderness. In the week after that, on a week later, on Sunday, March 21st, we have a Yom Iyun for getting ready for Pesach with 2 sessions. We have Adoption or Resistance, the Structure of the Seder, and the Greco-Roman Symposium with Dr. Yair Furstenberg, as well as Remembering the Korban Pesach in Masechet Pesachim and in Ancient Jewish Sources, Dr. Yedida Koren. Again, that's Sunday the 21st from 11:30 to 1:30 for the 2 sessions. On Tuesday, March 23rd, we have an event called Seder Telling at 8 in the evening. That is going to be an opportunity to come together with different storytellers from around the Jewish world, thinking through in their own terms the ways to understand the meaning of the Seder, to hear an unscripted reenactment, an opportunity to get different perspectives on the deeper meanings behind the holiday. And then finally, rounding out our pre-Pesach learning, we have a Tani Bechorot Siyum with Rabbi Leah Sarna at 8 a.m. on Thursday, March 25th. Rabbi Sarna will be completing her study of Masechet Pesachim. So you can get more information about all of those events on our website at drisha.org/classes. And of course, stay tuned. Hopefully very soon, we're going to have information coming out about our post-Pesach programming as well.